The discovery happened on a quiet Saturday morning in March, when Ronaldo was leaving his Madrid home for training and noticed a bailiff's notice posted on the door of the modest apartment next to his luxury compound, a stark reminder that economic hardship could exist literally next door to extraordinary wealth. And when he read the eviction notice that gave the resident 48 hours to vacate the premises due to unpaid rent, he realized that someone who had been his neighbor for 3 years was facing homelessness, while he lived in a mansion worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. And the proximity of this crisis to his daily life made it impossible to ignore or treat as someone else's problem that required only distant sympathy rather than direct intervention. The neighbor was a 70-year-old retired teacher named Elena Morales, who had been living in the same small apartment for 15 years, but whose pension had become inadequate to cover rising living costs and rent increases that had made her neighborhood increasingly expensive as property values rose, due partly to the presence of celebrities and wealthy individuals who had transformed what had once been a working-class area into a luxury residential district where longtime residents were being displaced by economic forces beyond their control. And Elena's situation represented a broader pattern of gentrification that pushed out the very people who had built and maintained communities that became desirable precisely because of their authentic character and strong social bonds that were being destroyed by development that prioritized profit over community preservation. Elena had been struggling financially for 18 months, ever since her husband's death had reduced her household income by half, while medical bills from his final illness had consumed most of their modest savings, and her attempts to find part-time work that could supplement her pension had been unsuccessful due to age discrimination that made employers reluctant to hire someone in her 70s. Despite her decades of experience as an educator whose skills and knowledge could have been valuable in many contexts, economic systems valued wisdom and experience, rather than youth and perceived productivity, that often ignored the contributions that older workers could make to organizations and communities that benefited from their perspective and dedication. The eviction notice that Ronaldo had seen represented the culmination of a legal process that had been ongoing for 6 months, with Elena's landlord pursuing removal proceedings that would allow him to renovate the apartment and rent it at market rates that were 3 times what Elena could afford on her pension. And despite her perfect rental history and her obvious care for the property that she had maintained meticulously during 15 years of tenancy, her inability to pay increased rent had made her expendable in a housing market where tenant protections were weak and landlord profits were prioritized over housing stability for longtime residents whose displacement served economic interests rather than community welfare. The conversation that followed when Ronaldo knocked on Elena's door was initially awkward for both of them, with Elena embarrassed about her circumstances and surprised that her famous neighbor had noticed her situation, while Ronaldo struggled to find appropriate words to offer help without insulting her dignity or making her feel like a charity case whose problems existed primarily to make wealthy people feel good about their generosity, rather than addressing systematic issues that created housing insecurity for millions of elderly people whose pensions were inadequate to cover basic living expenses in economies that prioritized growth over security for vulnerable populations. Elena's pride and independence made her initially reluctant to accept assistance from someone she barely knew, despite their years of living next door to each other. But her desperate circumstances and the immediate threat of homelessness gradually overcame her reservations about accepting help that she couldn't repay, especially when Ronaldo explained that her situation had made him realize his own responsibilities to use his resources constructively rather than simply accumulating wealth, while neighbors faced crises that he could easily address if he chose to prioritize community welfare over personal comfort and convenience that his money provided, while others struggled with basic necessities like stable housing. The immediate solution that Ronaldo provided involved paying Elena's back rent and covering her housing costs for the following year, while she worked with social services to access additional pension benefits and housing assistance that she had been eligible for but hadn't known how to obtain due to bureaucratic complexity that often prevented elderly people from accessing support programs that required navigation of systems designed for efficiency rather than accessibility by people who might need help understanding applications, and requirements that were unnecessarily complicated for people whose circumstances made them vulnerable to administrative errors and delays. The legal intervention that followed involved Ronaldo's attorneys working with tenant rights organizations to challenge the eviction proceedings and negotiate a long-term lease agreement that would protect Elena from future rent increases that could destabilize her housing situation. And this legal work revealed broader patterns of elder abuse by landlords who targeted elderly tenants for eviction because they assumed such tenants would be less likely to fight removal proceedings effectively or to understand their legal rights in situations where knowledge of tenant protections could mean the difference between stable housing and homelessness for people whose age made finding alternative housing extremely difficult. The housing advocacy organization that emerged from Elena's case became a comprehensive program that provided legal assistance, financial counseling, and housing advocacy for elderly residents who were facing displacement due to gentrification, rent increases, or landlord harassment that used legal technicalities to remove longtime tenants whose presence interfered with property development plans that prioritized maximum rental income over community stability and the welfare of people who had contributed to neighborhood character and social cohesion for decades, before economic pressures made their presence inconvenient for property owners who viewed housing as investment commodity rather than essential human need. Elena's gratitude for Ronaldo's intervention was expressed not through excessive thanks, but through her continued presence in the neighborhood where she had built relationships and community connections over 15 years. And her stability allowed her to continue volunteering at the local primary school, where her experience as a retired teacher provided valuable assistance to overworked educators who appreciated having someone with her knowledge and patience available to help students who needed additional support that budget constraints prevented schools from providing through paid staff positions that would have addressed educational needs more systematically. The ripple effects of Elena's case extended throughout the neighborhood as other elderly residents learned about tenant rights and housing assistance programs that they had previously been unaware of, and the legal precedents established through her successful defense against eviction proceedings provided protection for other vulnerable tenants who faced similar threats from landlords who had assumed that elderly residents would be easy targets for removal proceedings that could increase property values at the expense of community stability and social cohesion that benefited all residents regardless of their economic status or property ownership. The intergenerational friendship that developed between Ronaldo and Elena became a source of perspective and wisdom that enriched both their lives, with Elena sharing stories about neighborhood history and social changes that she had witnessed over decades of residence, while Ronaldo provided practical assistance and connections that helped Elena navigate bureaucratic systems and access services that improved her quality of life, while allowing her to maintain independence and dignity that were essential to her sense of self-worth and community belonging that housing stability had preserved. The community garden that Elena established on unused space near their apartment building became a gathering place for neighbors of all ages and backgrounds, with Ronaldo's financial support providing supplies and infrastructure that transformed vacant land into productive space where residents could grow food, socialize, and build relationships that strengthened community bonds while providing practical benefits like fresh vegetables and outdoor recreation that improved health and well-being for people who might otherwise have little access to green space or agricultural activities in urban environments. The scholarship program that Elena inspired focused on supporting older adults who wanted to continue learning and contributing to their communities through education and volunteer work that utilized their experience and knowledge in ways that benefited younger generations while providing meaningful activities that maintained intellectual engagement and social connection during retirement years that could otherwise become isolating and unproductive for people whose skills and wisdom deserved recognition and utilization, rather than being dismissed due to age discrimination that wasted human resources while creating social problems. Years later, when Elena had celebrated her 80th birthday surrounded by neighbors who considered her a community elder whose presence enriched their lives, when the housing advocacy program had prevented hundreds of elderly evictions and established policy changes that protected vulnerable tenants throughout Madrid, when the community garden had become a model for neighborhood development that prioritized residents' welfare over developers' profits, Ronaldo would reflect that discovering Elena's eviction notice had taught him that wealth without awareness of surrounding community needs was meaningless, that true security came from living in neighborhoods where all residents were stable and supported, and that sometimes the most important investments were in people and relationships, rather than financial instruments that generated profit without creating human value or community strength that benefited everyone involved.